In this session, we're going to look at monopolies and what gives rise to some of the power that they have, what we call market power. And in particular, we're also going to look at the role of government regulation, how governments can contribute to this monopoly type power or market power. So what are the sources of market power? One can be consumer taste. So consumers may dictate that there are no substitutes for a particular product. They may see it as, or they may have a very price and elastic demand for that product. There may simply be no substitutes actually, so that may not give consumers much choice. Or government actions may lead to the creation of monopolies or oligopolies where there are a few large firms in a market. So governments can do this, for example, by granting a limited number of licenses to operate in a particular industry. Say, for instance, in your cellular network operators in South Africa, there are only a few firms. Hospitals, also the operation of international airports, licenses are only granted to a limited number of firms. And this may be done for good reasons, but we need to ask, well, what are the consequences of this, and to what extent can we encourage competition in those industries? A firm may control an essential facility, a scarce resource or a key input. You only have to think of De Beers diamonds previously in South Africa as a very good example of a monopoly, having control over an input. You can also think of Table Mountain, the cable car operator. There's only one there, again for good reason though, but what are the consequences of that? A firm may have certain cost advantages due to having a superior technology or better way of organizing production. So you've probably heard of a natural monopoly before, and a natural monopoly is able to achieve economies of scale through bulk buying, specialization, the division of labor, etc. And so a natural monopoly will have a falling long-run average cost curve over a very large section of output. So the long-run average cost curve is falling. And in this case, it may therefore be argued that it's possibly better to have one large firm that achieves such economies of scale rather than two or more firms. However, the counter-argument is, does a monopoly always pass on such a cost advantage or achieve this, particularly when they're state-run? So governments can create monopolies by restricting access, by preventing competing firms from entering a market. And we can think of many examples of these monopolies. Eskom in South Africa, state-run power utility, and its inefficiencies, which have been in the press several times in the last few years. Postal services in most countries also are typically monopolies or near monopolies. We've loaded some articles about Eskom because it's topical. The latest one that I've loaded, President Ramaphosa is saying the power utility Eskom is currently facing major challenges, and he's acknowledging that it may need a bit of competition. And the previous article also talks about breaking Eskom up into different parts so that they can try and improve its efficiency. So load shedding, a very hot topic. Governments may also lead to the creation of market power through the issuing of patents. And a patent is the exclusive right that's given to an inventor of some product, technique, or process that gives them a certain amount of protection for a fixed period of time. So it's often given to, for example, pharmaceutical companies. So if they invent a drug, they'll get protection from direct copying competition for that product for a certain number of years. And the reason for this is so that there's an incentive to create such technology or such a drug. So it may cost a firm millions of dollars on research and development to discover a new technology or a new drug, and they may never discover it. So the incentive for doing so are potentially large profits that can be made. However, once that drug is in place, the marginal cost of providing it is usually very low. Marginal cost of providing one more unit of this item. However, it's sold at a very high price. And so the counter argument there is, well, is that right for consumers that the price is so much higher than marginal cost? But if you did away with the patents, would we see any research and development by these companies? Would we therefore lose out on very important technological processes and drug inventions? Very, very topical at the moment when we're talking COVID and we're talking about research and development for a potential drug or a vaccine. The example that the textbook Perloff gives is of the ophthalmologist Dr. Alan Scott, who turned the deadly poison that we now know, Botox, into a miracle drug that was used to treat two eye conditions. The one in which the eyes are not properly aligned, and the other one was for an uncontrollable closure of the eyes. And the textbook suggests that Dr. Scott was rather amused to see the unintended beneficiaries of his research rocking up at the Academy Awards each year. So he didn't intend it for cosmetic use, which it has now been used for down the line. So Botox is now sold in millions of vials per year. And the textbook talks about Allergan as having a near monopoly in this market for the treatment of wrinkles, etc. And it looks at, if you look at this particular diagram, let's just get the laser pointer here, you can see your marginal cost of a vial of that Botox is very low at 25. It's constant, it's fixed, equal to average variable cost at $25 a vial. Where this monopoly operates, where it's MR equals MC at an output of 1 million vials per year, go up to the demand curve and the price charge is 400. So look at that, price to marginal cost, the markup there, 400 is the price where the marginal cost of providing it is only $25. So you can see consumer surplus is equal to this area A, blue shaded triangle, 187.5 million. Your producer surplus is large, it's sitting at 375 million, and there is a dead weight loss to society, obviously, because a lower quantity is being produced than under perfect competition. But once again, without having certain patents in place, these companies would not have an incentive to spend on research and development. But this is the counter argument to this whole thing, the negative consequences, the dead weight loss to society, and massive monopoly profits. There's an interesting article here that we've loaded on academics, researchers and teachers supporting South Africa's call to scrap global COVID-19 medicine patents. Okay, so they've joined this group, and you can have a look at this article, and you can see the arguments for and against this. So just to make it topical and relevant to your lives. Okay, so going back to natural monopoly, a firm that can produce the total output of the market at a lower cost than several firms could. So this is the reason why they grant monopoly rights in the first place, particularly to public utilities in the generation of electricity, water, mail delivery, etc. So due to these economies of scale, etc. So the argument is that one company can produce at a cost, this is the total output, this cost is less than the cost of a whole lot of little companies producing their individual outputs, like firm 1 producing Q1, firm 2, Q2, etc., up to n number of firms. So the cost associated with one firm producing the entire market output would be less than the cost, if you added up, of a whole lot of firms operating individually. So let's have a look. So we see in this example, we've got a fixed marginal cost here, and we've got economies of scale, we've got a falling long-run average cost curve. And we can see that if you had two firms, each producing 6 units, they would be doing so at a cost of $20, okay, per unit, as opposed to one firm, if it was able to produce 12 units, as opposed to 2 each producing 6, that could be achieved at a lower cost of 15. So therefore, this is the argument. One firm can produce at lower cost, and it may be better, therefore, to have a natural monopoly in that market. But as I said to you, provided they are efficient and achieve economies of scale, and that they don't, due to their market power, not pass that on to the consumer. In some markets, the government may try to eliminate the deadweight loss that we see that arises due to monopoly by requiring that it charges the competitive price, the same price you would see if you had perfect competition. So it's as if there's a price ceiling where your marginal cost or your supply curve equals your demand curve in the market. So let's look at an example. Okay, there's your market demand. Your marginal cost or supply curve, if you're looking at a market overall, the demand intersects your supply at this point here. Okay, so that would be your competitive equilibrium. Where would a monopoly produce? It would produce where an MR, it's one firm, so it looks at, for one firm it uses the profit maximizing rule, where MR equals MC, and it would produce an output of 6, and you go up to the demand curve and it would charge a price of 18. So if government felt that that price is too high and they want to regulate this industry, they could look at where would a competitive firm operate. Well, we know it's where the market demand equals the supply. It would be at this point here, and it would produce this output. However, we don't have a perfectly competitive industry, but what it could do is to force it to charge a price equal to that a competitive market would charge up until where the competitive market would operate, up until this point. And so why are we getting a kinked line here for your marginal revenue curve is now your marginal revenue is going to be the same as your demand curve. Your demand curve is actually going to be flat across this section. It's not going to follow this anymore because the firm is forced to charge this price. Say it's equal to 16. It's forced to keep to this price, so the demand curve will be equal to your marginal revenue because each unit, like with perfect competition, has to be sold at that price. So your MR is equal to price. There's a flat line here equal to your demand curve, and then the demand curve can carry on as it was previously. They could charge a lower price, but they're obviously not going to do so. And your marginal revenue curve therefore becomes the same. It follows your demand curve up until this point. We then get a section that's discontinuous here, and then your slope of your MR curve now follows the demand curve, but remember it's got twice the slope. So your MR curve does this flat over the section, this little section here where it's discontinuous, and then it follows the demand curve with twice the slope. So this is what happens when you regulate this industry. As I say, you just go back to this. This is where a monopoly would operate, where MR is equal to MC, charge this output and price. If that's felt to be too high, they could force it to charge a price equal to 16, where demand equals supply, where a competitive firm would operate. So they have to charge a price of 16 up until that point. After that, they could charge a lower price, but it's unlikely they would do so. So your MR curve, instead of being downward sloping over this whole section, it's going to follow your demand curve up until this point. Then you get a discontinuous section, and then it'll continue to follow the previous MR curve. So that is what it looks like. So what would your consumer surplus be without regulation? Okay. Well, this area A would have been consumer surplus without regulation. If you just had a normal monopoly where MR is equal to MC, you go up to your demand curve. Price charge is 18. So the area below the price, below the demand curve rather, it gives the price people were willing to pay, but they only pay 18. So that leaves you with this area A as consumer surplus. Areas B and D would have been producer surplus, the area below the price charged of 18 up until the output produced, and above your marginal cost curve, the difference between the price the producer gets and the marginal cost up into the output produced gives you areas B and D, that's producer surplus. That's without regulation, normal monopoly. C and E, as we know from before, they are the areas of dead weight loss. Now, with this regulation, basically it's like perfect competition. It's forced to charge a price of 16. The demand curve follows this line up into this point, the same as the MR curve. Your consumer surplus is there for area A, B, and C, area below the demand and above the price line. The area between this price line and the marginal cost curve, areas D and E, become your producer surplus. So there's no dead weight loss, and welfare together is the sum of consumer and producer surplus. So it's very similar to your competitive outcome. So that looks fantastic if you were able to regulate the monopoly in such a way. However, what are the problems with this? Well, the first problem is if you set that price ceiling below the firm's minimum average cost curve, the firm will actually go bankrupt and you'll have no firm. You had a monopoly, so now there's no firm in the market. The other thing is that regulators are often captured. So regulated firms may bribe or influence the people doing the regulation. Okay, so this is a disadvantage. Often they've operated in those industries and they know the regulated firms. So there may be an incentive for this bribery to occur. There may also be limited information about the particular demand and marginal cost curve. So you may get the price wrong if you're government. And again, if you set that below its minimum average cost curve, below the optimally regulated price, the firm will shut down, and basically your dead weight loss therefore is all your consumer and producer surplus. No firm, which is far worse than any alternative. So it's very important to try to get this right. So alternatives to this are increasing competition by eliminating or reducing barriers to entry, rather allowing entrance into a market, and often a barrier to entry may be the large setup costs of operating in telecommunications or energy provision, etc., and what government can do to lower those barriers. South Africa has competition authorities to also increase competition. We're going to talk about our competition policy later on. And it's not always feasible where there is truly a natural monopoly and it has a cost advantage. You may not be able to equate that with perfect competition or regulate it in such a way. Go through these multiple choice questions and we will chat about these further in your Zoom session, and we will go through the answers to this.